single gunshot echoed through the canyon as Rebecca Vance's body crumpled to the ground, blood seeping through her fingers as she clutched her side, her vision blurring as her attackers mounted their horses and disappeared into the fading light, leaving nothing but dust and the scent of gunpowder in their wake. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving New Mexico Territory was no place for a woman alone, especially one who had witnessed something she shouldn't have. Rebecca's breaths came in ragged gasps as she dragged herself toward a shallow overhang in the canyon wall, the scorching afternoon sun bearing down mercilessly on her pale skin. 24 years she'd been on this earth, and now she might not see 25. "You won't make it through the night," one of the men had sneered before they rode off, leaving her for dead in Eagle Canyon, a desolate stretch of red rock that had claimed many lives before hers. Rebecca pressed her back against the cool stone, trying to stem the flow of blood from her side. The bullet had torn through her flesh, but miraculously hadn't hit anything vital, at least not that she could tell. Still, without help, infection would set in quickly, and the desert night would bring freezing temperatures her weakened body couldn't withstand. Miles away, in the small settlement of Copper Creek, Forrest Fitzgerald tightened the cinch on his chestnut stallion, Thunder. At 28, Forrest had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable trackers in the territory. A former cavalry scout who'd found more peace with horses than with people, he now worked as the town's deputy when he wasn't guiding travelers through the treacherous terrain. "Forrest, you ain't thinking of heading out tonight, are you?" Sheriff Mills leaned against the doorframe of the small jailhouse, concern etched across his weathered face. "That storm's rolling in from the west, and Eagle Canyon's treacherous even in daylight." Forrest adjusted his hat, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. Diaz's daughter said she saw riders heading that way, and they weren't locals. Same description as the men who robbed the Tucson stage last week. "If they're holed up in the canyon, I need to find them before they move on." The sheriff shook his head. "At least wait until morning. No sense in getting yourself killed over a hunch." But Forrest had already made up his mind. Something about this didn't sit right with him, the same feeling he'd had during the war, when ambushes were imminent. He mounted Thunder and checked his Winchester rifle one last time. "I'll be back by noon tomorrow," he said, nudging his horse forward. "And if I'm not, you'll know where to start looking." The sheriff watched as Forrest disappeared into the gathering darkness, the sound of Thunder's hooves fading into the night. The wind had picked up by the time Forrest reached the mouth of Eagle Canyon, bringing with it the scent of rain. He dismounted, leading Thunder carefully along the narrow trail. The canyon walls loomed on either side, casting deep shadows that his lantern barely penetrated. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening more painful than the last. The sun had long since disappeared, and the cold had settled into her bones. She'd torn strips from her petticoat to bind her wound, but she could feel the sticky warmth of fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. In her delirium, she thought of her father's ranch in Colorado, of her mother's grave beneath the old oak tree. She'd left it all behind 3 months ago, taking a position as a teacher in Santa Fe. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to make her own way. Instead, she'd stumbled upon those men dividing their stolen bounty while collecting plants for her students' science lessons. A simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A sound cut through her thoughts, the soft clopping of hooves on stone. Rebecca tensed, fighting through the fog of pain. Had they returned to finish the job? She shrank further into the shadows, ignoring the screaming protest from her wound. Forrest noticed the tracks almost immediately. Multiple horses had passed through recently, and they'd been in a hurry. He followed them deeper into the canyon, moving slowly, his senses alert for any sign of a camp or hideout. Thunder suddenly tossed his head, nostrils flaring. "What is it, boy?" Forrest whispered, reaching for his rifle. Thunder snorted softly, pawing at the ground. Forrest raised his lantern higher, scanning the canyon walls. There, almost hidden by an outcropping of rock, he caught a glimpse of something white fabric, perhaps. "Hello," he called cautiously, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Anyone there?" Rebecca heard the man's voice, deep and steady. Not the harsh tones of her attackers. Hope flickered within her, but caution kept her silent. She'd trusted too easily before. Forrest moved closer, his hand on his holstered revolver. As the light from his lantern spilled over the recess in the rock, he saw her a young woman, her dress torn and bloodied, her face pale as moonlight against the darkness of her hair. "Madam," he said softly, approaching slowly, "I'm Deputy Fitzgerald from Copper Creek. Are you hurt?" Rebecca tried to speak, but her throat was parched. All she could manage was a ragged whisper. "They shot me." Forrest was at her side in an instant, setting down his lantern and kneeling beside her. With gentle hands, he moved her own away from her side, examining the wound. "You've lost a lot of blood," he said, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "But I think the bullet went clean through. Can you tell me your name?" "Rebecca," she managed. "Rebecca Vance." "Miss Vance, I'm going to get you out of here, but it's going to hurt. The nearest doctor is back in Copper Creek, about 3 hours' ride." He glanced at the sky, where clouds were gathering ominously. "And we need to beat that storm." Rebecca nodded weakly. "I can try." Forrest retrieved his canteen, helping her take small sips of water before he set about fashioning a more secure bandage from his own shirt. His hands were surprisingly gentle for a man who looked so rough around the edges, his touch almost reverent as he worked to stem the bleeding. "Who did this to you?" he asked as he helped her to her feet. Rebecca swayed, leaning heavily against him. "3 men. Robbers. I saw them. With the gold from the stage." Forrest's jaw tightened. His hunch had been right. "The Harding gang. They've been terrorizing this territory for months." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "Can you ride?" I think so." With extreme care, Forrest helped Rebecca onto Thunder's back before mounting behind her. He cradled her against his chest, one arm secure around her waist, mindful of her wound. "Hold on tight, Miss Vance," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I'll get you to safety." As they began the slow journey out of the canyon, the first drops of rain started to fall, pattering against the brim of Forrest's hat and hissing as they hit the heated rocks. Rebecca leaned back against his solid warmth, fighting to stay conscious. There was something comforting about the steady beat of his heart against her back, the careful way he held her as if she were made of porcelain. The rain intensified as they reached the canyon mouth, coming down in heavy sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet. Thunder plodded steadily onward, but the trail was quickly turning to mud. "We can't make it to town in this," Forrest said, his voice raised against the downpour. "There's a line shack about a mile from here. We'll shelter there until the storm passes." Rebecca nodded mutely, too exhausted to speak. The pain in her side had dulled to a persistent throb, but her entire body felt cold and numb, a dangerous sign. She knew. The line shack appeared like a mirage through the curtain of rain, a small, weathered structure nearly hidden among a stand of junipers. Forrest dismounted quickly, helping Rebecca down before leading Thunder to the meager shelter of an attached lean-to. Inside, the shack was sparse but dry. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a narrow cot against the opposite wall. Forrest worked quickly, lighting the lantern hanging from a ceiling beam and starting a fire in the stove with the dry wood stacked beside it. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes," he said, then immediately flushed. I have a spare shirt in my saddlebag. You'll catch your death otherwise." Rebecca managed a weak smile despite her pain. I appreciate the concern for my propriety, Deputy, but I think survival takes precedence. Forrest nodded, retrieving his saddlebags from Thunder. He turned his back as Rebecca struggled out of her sodden dress, offering assistance only when she gasped in pain. I need to check your wound again, he said once she was settled on the cot, swimming in his spare flannel shirt. The bleeding seems to have slowed, but I'm worried about infection. Rebecca watched through half-lidded eyes as he carefully removed the bandage. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern, revealing a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of the desert sky at dusk. There was kindness in those eyes, and something else, a haunted quality that spoke of hardships endured. Have you done this before? She asked as he cleaned the wound with whiskey from his flask, making her hiss in pain. In the war, he replied quietly. I was a scout for the Union, but you end up being whatever's needed in battle, fighter, medic, gravedigger. He paused, his hands stilling for a moment. I'm sorry that was morbid. It's honest, Rebecca said. I prefer honest to comforting lies. Forrest's lips quirked into a half-smile as he applied a fresh bandage. Then honestly, Miss Vance, you're lucky to be alive. That bullet missed your vital organs by inches. Call me Rebecca, she said. I think saving my life puts us on a first-name basis. Deputy Fitzgerald. Forrest, he corrected, his smile widening slightly. And I haven't saved you yet. We still need to get you to Dr. Whitman in Copper Creek. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the small window and wind howling through the eaves. Forrest added more wood to the stove, then settled on the floor beside the cot, his back against the wall. You should rest, he said, pulling his revolver from its holster and setting it on his lap. I'll keep watch. In case they come back? Rebecca asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Forrest's eyes met hers, steady and reassuring. They won't get near you again. I promise. Something in his tone made Rebecca believe him implicitly. Despite the pain and the danger, she felt safe for the first time since the attack. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her last thought was of his arms around her as they rode through the darkness. Rebecca woke to sunlight streaming through the dusty window and the smell of coffee. She blinked, disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She tried to sit up, gasping as pain lanced through her side. Easy, Forrest said, appearing at her side with a tin cup of steaming coffee. The storm's passed, but you're still in no condition to travel far. Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully, noticing that Forrest looked as if he hadn't slept at all. You stayed awake all night? He shrugged, running a hand through his tousled dark hair. Force of habit. How are you feeling? Like I've been shot, she replied with a wry smile, then sobered. Thank you, Forrest. If you hadn't come along. But I did, he said simply. And now we need to figure out our next steps. Rebecca sipped her coffee, savoring its warmth. The men who shot me, they'll be looking for me. They can't risk leaving a witness. Forrest nodded grimly. The Harding gang doesn't leave loose ends. But I need to get you to a doctor, and Copper Creek is still our best option. Tell me about yourself, Rebecca said suddenly, surprising both of them. I'd like to know more about the man who saved my life. Forrest looked uncomfortable, but he settled onto a wooden chair near the cot. Not much to tell. I was born in Missouri, joined the Union Army at 17, came west after the war. Been in Copper Creek 5 years now. Family? A shadow crossed his face. Lost my parents to cholera when I was young. No siblings. The closest thing I have to family is Thunder out there. Rebecca watched him, sensing there was more to his story than he was sharing. I lost my mother 3 years ago. My father remarried last spring, a woman half his age with expensive tastes. He was disappointed when I decided to become a teacher instead of finding a suitable husband. Is that why you came to the territory? To teach? Rebecca nodded. I wanted to make my own way, build something meaningful. She laughed bitterly. And here I am, shot and hiding in a line shack. Not exactly the adventure I envisioned. The day's not over yet, Forrest said with a hint of a smile. And neither is your adventure. As the morning progressed, Rebecca's strength began to return. Forrest changed her bandage again, his relief evident when he saw no signs of infection. We should head for Copper Creek soon, he said, glancing outside. The trail will be muddy, but passable. Can you manage? Rebecca nodded, determined. I can manage. Forrest helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. They were standing close enough that Rebecca could feel the warmth radiating from his body, see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Forrest cleared his throat, stepping back. I'll get Thunder ready. The journey to Copper Creek was slow and arduous. Rebecca rode in front of Forrest again, cradled against his chest as Thunder picked his way carefully along the muddy trail. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the sounds of the desert coming back to life after the storm. Birds calling, lizards skittering across sun-warmed rocks, the occasional distant yip of a coyote. By mid-afternoon, the small settlement of Copper Creek came into view, a cluster of wooden buildings straddling a creek that flashed copper in the sunlight. Rebecca felt Forrest tense behind her. What is it? She asked, turning her head to look at him. Riders, he said quietly, nodding toward the edge of town. 3 of them watching the trail. Rebecca's heart stuttered. The men who shot me? Likely. They must have figured I'd bring you here. Forrest pulled Thunder to a halt, considering. There's another way into town through the old mining camp. It's longer, but they won't be watching for us there. He guided Thunder off the main trail, cutting through a stand of scrub oak and heading toward a series of low hills to the west of town. Rebecca leaned more heavily against him, fatigue and pain making it difficult to stay upright. Stay with me, Rebecca, Forrest murmured, his lips close to her ear. Just a little further. The old mining camp was a ghost town, abandoned shacks and rusted equipment standing sentinel over played-out claims. Thunder's hooves echoed loudly between the empty buildings, making Rebecca flinch at each sound. Almost there, Forrest assured her as they emerged on the far side of the camp, Copper Creek visible once more. He guided Thunder down a steep embankment to a narrow stream, following its course until they reached the back of a large white building with a small cross painted on its door, the doctor's house. Forrest dismounted quickly, then lifted Rebecca from the saddle. She clung to him, her face pressed against his neck as he carried her to the door and kicked it with his boot. Dr. Whitman, a thin man with spectacles and a shock of white hair, opened the door, his expression changing from annoyance to alarm as he took in the sight before him. Forrest? What in God's name? She's been shot, Forrest said, brushing past the doctor and into the house. The Harding gang. They're in town, looking for her. Dr. Whitman's face hardened as he led them to a small examination room. Put her on the table. Clara, he called, and a middle-aged woman appeared from another room. Prepare for surgery, and send Bobby to fetch the sheriff. Clara nodded, her experienced eyes taking in Rebecca's condition before she hurried away. Forrest laid Rebecca gently on the table, but when he tried to step back, she grabbed his hand. Don't leave, she whispered, fear evident in her eyes. Forrest squeezed her hand. I won't, I promise. Dr. Whitman worked efficiently, cutting away the bandage and examining the wound. You did a good job with this, Forrest. Clean through, no major vessels hit. She's lost blood, but with rest and care, she'll heal. Rebecca's grip on Forrest's hand tightened as the doctor began cleaning the wound more thoroughly. Forrest leaned down, his voice low and soothing. "Tell me about your students," he said, clearly trying to distract her from the pain. "What were you teaching them before this happened?" Through gritted teeth, Rebecca began to talk about the children in her class in Santa Fe, about their curiosity and enthusiasm. She described a lesson on native plants that had led her to Eagle Canyon, collecting specimens for the classroom. The children were particularly fascinated by the medicinal uses, she said, gasping as Dr. Whitman applied a stinging solution to her wound. "The local women have been teaching me." She broke off as the door burst open and Sheriff Mills strode in, his weathered face grim. "They're at the saloon," he said without preamble. "All three of them, bold as brass." Forrest straightened, his expression hardening, but he didn't release Rebecca's hand. "Rebecca Vance, this is Sheriff Mills." She witnessed the Harding gang dividing their take from the Tucson stage robbery. "They shot her and left her for dead in Eagle Canyon." The sheriff nodded to Rebecca. "Madam, sorry to meet under these circumstances." He turned back to Forrest. "I sent word to Marshal Davis in Santa Fe. He's been hunting these men for months, but it'll take him at least 2 days to get here." "We can't wait that long," Forrest said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They know she's alive, and they know she's here. They'll try again." Dr. Whitman looked up from his work, his eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. "She can't be moved again, not for at least a week. The risk of reopening the wound is too great." A tense silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft sounds of Clara preparing bandages. "Then we bring them to justice here," Sheriff Mills said finally. "Tonight." Forrest nodded, his jaw set. "I'll help you." "No." Rebecca tightened her grip on his hand. "They're killers. They won't hesitate to shoot you both." "Which is why we won't give them the chance," the sheriff said grimly. "Forrest, meet me at the jail in an hour. We'll formulate a plan." After the sheriff left, Dr. Whitman finished treating Rebecca's wound and gave her laudanum for the pain. As the medicine began to take effect, making the room swim around her, she clung to Forrest's hand. "Please be careful," she murmured, fighting to keep her eyes open. "I can't bear the thought of losing you when I've just found you." Forrest's expression softened as he looked down at her. "You won't lose me, Rebecca. I'll come back to you." As darkness fell over Copper Creek, Forrest and Sheriff Mills positioned themselves strategically around the Antelope Saloon. The plan was simple but dangerous. Sheriff Mills would enter through the front door, while Forrest covered the rear exit. They'd identified all 3 members of the Harding gang inside. Eli Harding himself, a vicious former Confederate guerrilla, his brother Luke, and their cousin, a man known only as Rattler for the snake tattoo that wound up his forearm. "Remember," Sheriff Mills said as they prepared to move, "these men have nothing to lose. They know the marshal's on his way, and they've got prices on their heads from here to Texas." Forrest checked his Winchester one last time. "I'll remember." The confrontation was swift and violent. Sheriff Mills entered the saloon first, his shotgun leveled at Eli Harding's chest. "You're under arrest for robbery, attempted murder, and a dozen other crimes across 2 territories," he announced, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent saloon. Eli Harding, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, smiled coldly. "Is that so, Sheriff? And who's going to testify against us?" "That schoolteacher we left for buzzard bait." "She's alive," Sheriff Mills replied, "and under the protection of this town." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Eli's hand moved toward his gun, and the sheriff fired his shotgun, the blast deafening in the confined space. Simultaneously, Luke Harding and Rattler dove for cover, drawing their own weapons. Forrest burst through the back door, his Winchester at the ready. He caught Luke Harding in his sights and fired, the bullet striking the outlaw in the shoulder, spinning him around. Sheriff Mills was locked in a deadly struggle with Eli, who had managed to close the distance despite being wounded by the shotgun blast. Rattler, seeing his chance, made for the front door. Forrest swung his rifle around, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from the saloon entrance. Rattler stumbled, then fell, revealing a small figure standing in the doorway. Clara, the doctor's assistant, holding a smoking Derringer. "He was going to shoot you in the back," she said matter-of-factly to the sheriff, who had finally subdued Eli Harding. The confrontation was over as quickly as it had begun. Eli and Luke Harding were wounded but alive, secured in the town jail to await the marshal's arrival. Rattler hadn't survived Clara's well-placed shot. Forrest rushed back to the doctor's house as soon as the prisoners were secured, finding Rebecca awake and anxious despite the laudanum. Her face lit up when she saw him, relief washing over her features. "You're alive," she breathed, reaching for him. Forrest took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that surprised them both. "I told you I'd come back." Over the next week, as Rebecca recovered under Dr. Whitman's care, Forrest visited her daily. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their lives, discovering shared interests and complementary differences. Rebecca learned that beneath Forrest's quiet exterior was a man of deep intelligence and surprising sensitivity, who read poetry by lamplight and knew the name of every star in the desert sky. Forrest, in turn, found himself captivated by Rebecca's strength and resilience, her quick mind and compassionate heart. She told him of her dreams to establish a proper school in one of the frontier towns, to bring education to children who might otherwise grow up without it. "Copper Creek could use a school," he said one evening as they sat on the doctor's back porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "The children here ride 10 miles to the mission school when weather permits, which isn't often." Rebecca glanced at him, a smile playing at her lips. "Are you suggesting I stay, Deputy Fitzgerald?" Forrest looked down at their intertwined hands. "I'm suggesting that I'd like you to consider it. Copper Creek might not be as grand as Santa Fe, but it has its charms." "And what would those be?" Rebecca asked, her heart quickening at the intensity in his gaze. "Well, there's the creek itself, prettiest water you've ever seen when the sun hits it just right. There's Mrs. Abernathy's apple pies at the boarding house. There's the wildflower bloom in spring that turns the whole valley purple and gold." He paused, his voice softening. "And there's me, if that counts for anything." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "It counts for everything." Marshal Davis arrived from Santa Fe 2 days later, escorting the Harding brothers to Territorial Prison to await trial. Before leaving, he took Rebecca's formal statement about what she had witnessed in Eagle Canyon. "You're a brave woman, Miss Vance," the marshal said, tipping his hat to her. "Thanks to you, we've put an end to a gang that's terrorized this territory for too long." After the marshal departed, Rebecca found herself at a crossroads. Dr. Whitman had declared her fit to travel, should she choose to return to Santa Fe. Her position at the school was still open, according to a telegram from the superintendent. But as she stood at the window of her room at the boarding house, looking out at the dusty main street of Copper Creek, she realized she had already made her decision. This small town, with its hard-working people and untamed beauty, had captured her heart, or perhaps it was the man who now appeared in the street below, leading thunder toward the boarding house. Forrest looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and smiled a genuine smile that transformed his serious face and made her heart skip. She waved, and he quickened his pace, disappearing into the building below. Moments later, there was a knock at her door. "Come in," Rebecca called. smoothing her skirts nervously. Forrest entered, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I heard the doctor cleared you for travel." Rebecca nodded. "He did. And will you be leaving us, then? Returning to Santa Fe?" There was something in his voice of vulnerability that made Rebecca cross the room to stand before him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, "about Copper Creek needing a school." Hope flickered across his face. And I think you're right. These children deserve an education, and She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've discovered there are things here worth staying for." Forrest took her hands in his gaze never leaving her face. "Rebecca, I know it hasn't been long, but these past weeks, getting to know you, I can't imagine my life without you in it now." Rebecca's heart soared at his words. "I feel the same way. I don't have much to offer," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Just my heart and a promise to cherish you every day for the rest of our lives. That's all I want," Rebecca whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Just you, Forrest. That's enough." He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded with a passion that matched his own. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Forrest rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he murmured. "Build your school. Build a life here. With me." Rebecca smiled, feeling as though her heart might burst with happiness. "I already am." 1 year later, Rebecca stood on the porch of the newly constructed Copper Creek School, watching as children spilled out into the yard at the end of the day. The school had been a community effort, with every family in town contributing in some way: lumber, labor, or lessons in practical skills that Rebecca incorporated into her curriculum. As the last child disappeared down the dusty street, a familiar figure on horseback appeared, and Rebecca's heart leapt as it always did at the sight of her husband. Forrest dismounted in one fluid motion, tying Thunder to the hitching post before climbing the steps to join her. "How was your day, Mrs. Fitzgerald?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "Enlightening," Rebecca replied with a smile. Tommy Jenkins finally mastered his multiplication tables, and Sarah Thompson brought in a horned toad for our nature studies. Forrest laughed, the sound still a revelation to Rebecca, who treasured each instance of his joy. "And how are you feeling?" he asked, his hand gently resting on the slight swell of her abdomen. "Wonderful," she assured him, covering his hand with her own. "Though your son or daughter has been quite active today." Pride and wonder crossed Forrest's face as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "Just like their mother, full of energy and determination." Rebecca leaned into his embrace, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here, from the terror of being left for dead in Eagle Canyon to the profound joy of building a life with the man who had ridden through the night to find her. "I love you, Forrest Fitzgerald," she said, looking up into the face that had become as essential to her as breathing. "And I love you, Rebecca Fitzgerald," he replied, his kiss a promise of all the years to come. "More than words can say." As they walked hand in hand toward their home at the edge of town, the setting sun gilded the landscape in amber light, transforming the small frontier settlement into something magical. Rebecca knew that life on the frontier would never be easy, but with Forrest by her side, she faced the future not with fear, but with hope and unwavering love. The canyon where she had almost lost her life was visible in the distance, a reminder not of trauma but of resilience, and of the night a lone cowboy had defied darkness and danger to save a stranger who would become the center of his world.